This is almost a non-story video. On October 1973, Israel was caught off guard. The Israeli tanks had no answer to the anti-tank Sagers. The Air Force had no solution to the anti-aircraft missiles. And the Israeli infantry was equipped with the ill-suited Uzis. The small force on the front line was completely swamped by the Egyptian army. So why do I still think it's important to tell non-stories? First, because it's a necessary introduction to the next video. And the second reason is to show how low or high can a tide be before everything changes. Come to think about it, this is a video about those who keep swimming. On the 28th of September 1970, the charismatic, all-powerful president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, passed away at the age of 58. Anwar Sadat was chosen as his successor. He was considered a compromise between the rival faction and Egypt's leading party. First, because he was Nasser's deputy, and second, because everyone thought he was a simple farm boy. As it turned out, he was anything but. Sadat turned out to be a shrewd, long-term strategic thinker who understood the conflict better than anyone else. Sadat immediately went ahead and liberalized the Egyptian economy and got closer to the West, while constantly demanding better equipment from the Soviet Union. I told Nasser that even if we can get hold of 10 centimeters of Sinai, it would be a strategic change for the region. We would cause the enemy losses and casualties that will destroy the deterrent concept that the Israelis are relying on. The side that will win the first battle will win the war. We have built our entire army accordingly. Egypt's grand strategy in 1973 was not to exterminate Israel or even take back the whole of Sinai. For Sadat, the whole purpose of the 1973 war was a battle of minds. By October 1973, the Egyptian army had more than 650,000 regular soldiers in more than 10 divisions. This meant the Egyptian army served as a constant friend to Israel, and as always, Israel relied on the reserve division to show up at the right time. Along the 160 kilometers of Suez Canal, Israel stationed one regular division, 252nd, and 16 outposts comprised of 20 or 30 infantry reserve soldiers. Those outposts were a subject of a bitter argument in the years before the war. During the attrition war, they had served as well-defended bunkers for the troops on the edges of the canal. When a ceasefire agreement was reached in August 1970, Dayan and Bar-Lev insisted the outpost had strategic and political value and should therefore be kept. On the other hand, Southern Front Commander Ariel Sharon and Deputy Chief of Staff Abraham Tal wanted to dismantle all of them. They reasoned that the outposts were A. too far apart to mitigate Egyptian crossing, B. during artillery bombardment no one will be able to keep his head up, let alone fire at the enemy, C. the IDF advantage is in maneuvers and not static warfare, and D. loyal to the ethos of no one left behind, the IDF will spend valuable resources trying to reach the outposts and save them. No prizes will be given to those of you that will guess who was right. As the tension grew, 90 Israeli tanks were stationed close to the canal with 190 more tanks in the back. I cannot to this day answer why anyone would think it would be enough to stop the Egyptian army crossing. Maybe in order to understand the IDF mindset, we need to explore their assumptions at the time. The IDF defense theory on the south was based on 3 legs. A. Israel would have enough time in advance to know about an enemy attack. With only 1 week's notice, the IDF could call in the reserve and be ready. With 3 days head notice, it would be a difficult task, but not an impossible one. B. The regulars will be able to halt and delay the attack. In case of a catastrophe, when only few days' notice will be given, the regulars' 252nd Division will delay the attack just long enough for the reserves to show up. And C. They wouldn't dare. This false assumption was a fruit of the IDF constant dilemma. It was clear there is simply not enough tanks to stop the flood. On the other hand, drafting reserves every time there is suspicion of war is extremely costly, not to mention the resentment that will surely be manifested in the next election. And so the Israeli intelligence was adamant Syria and Egypt would not attack. They reasoned that without a solution to Israeli air superiority and the tank maneuvers, the enemy would just stay put. This assumption remained even when Egypt and Syria's armies, equipped with SA-2, SA-3 and the new SA-6 anti-aircraft missiles. The wouldn't dare assumption remained even when Saggers and RPG were introduced to the region. Somehow everyone in Israel knew everything, and like any good tragedy, no one bothered to read the writing on the wall. In August 1973, Shmuel Gonen replaced Ariel Sharon as the Southern Sector Commander. He was 39 years old at the time and a rising star with a dubious character. Gonen enforced harsh discipline and autocratic command style everywhere he went. According to his own account, Gonen struggled to accept that a war is about to erupt. Even when Israel accepted a calamity is looming, a mind fog gripped the IDF generals. Usually one will not say obsession and understatement in the same sentence, but to say the Israelis are obsessed with documentation is an understatement. We simply have everything on the Israeli side. Not only testimonials of participants on all levels, but even transcript of Judicial Investigation Committee where generals testified under oath about their part in the war. As if that was not enough, someone in the IDF High Command recorded the most confidential discussions and even brigade-level radio communications. On the other side, we have nothing from Syria. In Syria, no one dares to speak his mind and live long enough to publish it. But on the Egyptian side, we have The Crossing, a book by the Chief of Staff at the time, Saad Shazli, which is a man of information. The numbers sometimes appear as if they were drawn from memory, and like any other autobiography, we need to take it with a grain of salt. However, since The Crossing is mainly an Egyptian endeavor, it is an incredibly valuable source that I will make great use of in this video. At exactly 14:05, 1,100 artillery barrels and 140 jets pounded the east side of the canal. With high-volume water pumps, the Egyptian engineer eroded the sand barriers on the canal banks. According to Shazli, within 2 hours, at 16:15, 23,000 Egyptian soldiers had crossed the canal and established bridgeheads 1.5 kilometers deep. At 17:15, Shazli reported that 5 infantry divisions crossed the canal almost without any losses. But due to muddy conditions in the south, 7th Division faced difficulties and delayed the deployment of the bridge. Wave 12 of the initial assault, the final wave, is a crossing over the barrier. In 3 hours, we have shipped over the canal 5 reinforced infantry divisions, 2,000 officers and 30,000 men with all the weapons they can handle, plus the men and equipment of 5 anti-tank guided weapons battalions. At 17:30, 40 Mi-8 helicopters with commando unit flew across the border. Their main task was to block the passages to Sinai and delay Israeli reinforcement reaching the front. They were sent to attack headquarters and logistic depots. Half of the helicopters were shot down by Israeli jets and fire from the ground. Those who reached their targets caused a considerable amount of mayhem. By 8:30, the first Egyptian tank had crossed the canal. It would be an historic encounter. The first combat between the essentially World War II concept of armor and the infantry weapons of the next generation. The Israeli response could be best described as confused. Reports of crossing all over the front reached the headquarters of the Southern Front, where they struggled to pinpoint Egypt's primary focus. It appears that General Gonen and other officers may not have fully taken into account numerous intelligence reports indicating the Soviet doctrine involves simultaneous attack across the entire front rather than concentrating on a single main effort. 14th Brigade was spread across 130-kilometer border. In an effort to avoid exacerbating the situation, or even more to avoid upsetting the White House, Israel retained 2 tank brigades in reserve even though everyone knew a war was imminent. Such was the disconnect in front of 12th Brigade crossing the canal with hundreds of Sager launchers and RPGs. Israel positioned 89 tanks at the front and 200 more in the back with an explicit order, not even 1 step back. As you can imagine, it did not end well for the Israeli side. With 33 tanks, the 9th Battalion was spread over 40 kilometers of front. While the tank commanders were looking for Egyptian tanks that were fired upon with Sagger missiles from ranges of more than 2 kilometers away. Further away from the effective range of the tanks, if ever they could have seen the infantry fire at them, which they couldn't. First tanks of the 9th Battalion got hit. In an attempt to avoid the missiles, the rest maneuvered sharply off the paved road and got stuck in the quicksand. 460 Brigade Commander was sent to help out in the north. He started 106 tanks and gradually had to split more and more of his brigade to plug holes in the north section. At 18:30, 460 Brigadier met 9th Battalion Commander who told him, "My entire battalion is gone." Instead of asking what went wrong and learning about the anti-tank weapons, 460 Brigadier charged on to save the besieged outpost of Milano and Mifreket. The constant cries for help from the besieged outpost clouded the judgment of the tank crews. Loyal to the ethos of no one left behind, Israel kept losing valuable tanks in order to reach the outpost. Once they finally got there, they faced refusal from the division command to evacuate anyone but the wounded. 252 Division Commander Mandler clearly misunderstood the situation. After he threw in all of his reserves to no avail, he refused an appeal from the outpost to retreat. He kept on refusing even when only 5 soldiers were left in Mifreket. Simultaneously, he refused any infantry reinforcement, leaving the remaining 5 facing impossible odds. 401 Brigade was sent to help out in the south. At 11 p.m., he called the division and asked to retreat from the canal. He reported that this sector is too long to keep, especially during the night. In addition to infantry with RPG, Egyptian tanks started to infiltrate the region, and 401 simply couldn't cover it all. He was refused. Instead of keeping his force for the morning, he was constantly ordered to prevent reported crossing and help besiege outposts. There is no point mentioning Israeli units from now on. Officers got hit, tank units left with only 2 or 3 functioning tanks. An effective radio jam made it almost impossible to communicate. Supported at last by armor, our infantry advanced through the early hours, pushing the bridgeheads out to 5 miles east of the canal. It is no picnic. The enemy armor formation are disorganized, reduced to disarray, but we note through the night hours that commanders of subunits, even individual tanks, fight on. They are evidently made of better stuff than their senior commanders. Twice, groups of enemy tanks managed to break through our infantry lines to reach the water's edge and bombed our bridges and ferries, inflicting significant damage. But it was a hopeless struggle. Before sunrise, the few surviving tanks are in retreat. After a night of heavy fire, 252 Division found out early Sunday morning that they lost 2/3 of their tanks with nothing to show for. The Egyptian crossings was a resounding success. What could Israel have done better? I have mentioned earlier in this video the big dispute in the IDF with regards to the defense concept. A minority in the IDF, Abraham Tal and Ariel Sharon, correctly assumed that in case of a war the outpost will be bombed constantly and will be unable to prevent any crossing. In any case, they argue, the only advantage the IDF have is in tank maneuvers with combined effort of artillery and air force. The static line of defense will negate the IDF advantage and will be another Maginot line. Instead, they offer to let them cross. Sinai Desert have 2 main passages, the Gidi and the Mitle. While protecting the passages, the IDF, they argue, would concentrate its effort on a small front and cross the canal to outflank and sever the Egyptian army. The entire folly was in wrong assumptions. Unlike 6 years before, when Israel had the entire Sinai Desert as a buffer zone, all Israel had now is 100-meter wide strip of water. With the USA strictly forbidding any preemptive strike, all Egypt had to do is pull a hair-trigger charge. Arguably, if more tank brigades would have encountered the Egyptian Saggers, the most likely outcome would have been more burned tanks. But the consensus after the war was that leaving the infantry in the outpost was a terrible miscalculation. They had no chance of impeding the Egyptian crossing, and later attempts to help the outpost were extremely pricey in tanks and lives.